They arrived at Graceland as royalty. 3 generations of the Presley name, each one carrying the weight of fame, fortune, and a legacy that would reshape American culture forever. But beneath the glittering surfaces of their lives, a darkness was quietly taking root, a darkness that would eventually claim all 3 of them. This is the untold story of the Presley Dynasty, a tale of addiction, tragedy, and the invisible enemy that no amount of money or fame could defeat. Elvis Aaron Presley was born on January 8, 1935, in a 2-room shotgun shack in Tupelo, Mississippi. His parents, Vernon and Gladys, were dirt poor. Vernon worked odd jobs, moving from place to place trying to provide for his growing family. Gladys was a homemaker, a woman of deep faith who believed her son was destined for something greater. But in those early years, there was nothing to suggest that this shy, awkward boy would one day become the king of rock and roll. Elvis was a mama's boy, always clinging to Gladys, always seeking her approval. She doted on him, protected him, loved him with an intensity that would shape his entire personality. Gladys made Elvis feel like he was special, like he was meant for greatness. And perhaps she was right. The Presley family moved to Memphis, Tennessee in 1948 when Elvis was 13 years old. It was in Memphis that everything changed. Elvis discovered music. He discovered rhythm. He discovered the raw, sexual energy that would eventually make him a star. At 16, Elvis walked into Sun's studio in Memphis with his mother, paying $4 to record a song. He was nervous, his voice cracking on the recording. But Sam Phillips, the owner of the studio, heard something special in that teenage boy's voice. He heard potential. He heard destiny. By 1954, Elvis had recorded "That's All Right," a blues song that would become his first hit. The song was unlike anything radio stations had ever played before. It was raw, it was sexual, it was dangerous. Radio stations played it constantly, and suddenly Elvis Presley became a household name. He was 18 years old. Girls screamed when he appeared. Adults were scandalized by his hip movements, which would become known as the Elvis gyration. Religious leaders called him the devil's music. Parents forbade their children from listening to him. But the more controversial he became, the more famous he grew. Elvis appeared on television for the first time on The Louisiana Hayride in 1954, and then on national television in 1956 on The Ed Sullivan Show. When Ed Sullivan asked him to perform Hound Dog, Elvis delivered a performance that would go down in history. His hips moved in ways that seemed impossible, his voice dripped with sexuality and confidence. The camera cut away from his hips because the censors deemed it too obscene for television. But it was too late. America had already fallen in love with Elvis Presley. He was the king of a new generation, the embodiment of teenage rebellion and sexual liberation. By 1956, Elvis had sold millions of records. He was making more money than he could possibly spend. Movie offers poured in. Every studio wanted him. Every producer wanted to work with him. At 19 years old, Elvis Presley had achieved a level of fame that most people could never even dream of. He was young, he was handsome, he was talented, and he seemed unstoppable. But success like that comes with a price. A price that Elvis would spend the rest of his life trying to pay. The pressures of fame began to mount almost immediately. Elvis was constantly followed by photographers. His every move was documented. His every relationship was analyzed and judged by millions of strangers. He couldn't go out in public without causing a riot. He couldn't eat at a restaurant without being mobbed. He couldn't sleep because of the constant noise and chaos surrounding him. To cope with the pressure, Elvis turned to medication. At first it was just sleeping pills. Then it was stimulants to keep him awake during long film shoots. Then it was pain medication for back injuries sustained during performances and filming. Elvis had access to the best doctors in the world, doctors who were more than happy to prescribe whatever medication he asked for. They saw him not as a patient but as a meal ticket. They saw his addiction as an opportunity to keep him coming back, to keep the money flowing. Graceland, Elvis's Memphis mansion, became a fortress where he could escape the madness of the outside world. He surrounded himself with a group of loyal friends and employees, the so-called Memphis Mafia, who would protect him, entertain him, and enable his every desire. But Graceland was also a bubble, a distorted reality where the normal rules didn't apply. Elvis could stay up for days at a time, pop pills, watch movies, and surround himself with beautiful women. Nobody told him no. Nobody challenged him. Nobody set boundaries. It was a recipe for disaster and everyone around him knew it. But nobody wanted to risk losing their job, their paycheck, their access to the king. In 1967, at the age of 32, Elvis married Priscilla Beaulieu. Priscilla was 14 years younger than Elvis, and he had met her while stationed in Germany with the U.S. Army in 1958. Their relationship was complicated, tinged with elements of control and obsession. Elvis was a controlling husband who wanted to dictate what Priscilla wore, how she spent her time, and who she spent it with. But Priscilla loved him, or at least she thought she did. On May 1, 1968, Priscilla gave birth to their daughter, Lisa Marie Presley. Lisa Marie was born into a world of unimaginable wealth and privilege. She lived in a mansion. She had servants. She had everything a child could possibly want, except a present, attentive father. Elvis was often distant, absorbed in his own world of pharmaceutical escapism. He would disappear into his bedroom for hours at a time, surrounded by his pills and his isolation. Priscilla raised Lisa Marie while Elvis performed, recorded, and made movies. The bond between Lisa Marie and her mother was strong, but the bond between Lisa Marie and her father was complicated and often painful. As Lisa Marie grew up, she witnessed the darker side of her father's life. She saw the addiction firsthand. She saw the way the medication slowly changed him, the way it made him paranoid and erratic. She saw the tension between her parents, the resentment that built up over years of emotional distance and betrayal. When Priscilla and Elvis divorced in 1972, Lisa Marie was devastated. She was only 4 years old, too young to understand why her father wasn't coming home anymore, too young to understand that his pharmaceutical addictions had made it impossible for him to be the husband and father that he wanted to be. After the divorce, Elvis was granted joint custody of Lisa Marie, but his involvement in her life remained sporadic and inconsistent. He would go through periods where he was deeply involved, taking her to movies, buying her presents, and doting on her. Then he would disappear back into Graceland and his pharmaceutical world, leaving Priscilla to raise their daughter alone. Lisa Marie developed a complex relationship with her father. She loved him desperately, but she also resented him for his absence. She wanted to know him, to understand him, but he seemed like a stranger, a ghost in a mansion. By the 1970s, Elvis's drug use had become a serious problem. He was taking uppers, downers, and everything in between. His doctor, George Nichopoulos, was one of the most complicit enablers of Elvis's addiction. Dr. Nick, as he was known, prescribed Elvis a staggering number of medications. Between 1971 and 1975 alone, Dr. Nick prescribed Elvis approximately 50,000 pills. 50,000 pills in just 4 years. These included amphetamines, depressants, and various other controlled substances. Dr. Nick justified these prescriptions by claiming that Elvis suffered from various ailments, insomnia, constipation, and other medical conditions. But the truth was far simpler. Elvis was an addict, and Dr. Nick was enabling that addiction for money and fame. The medication was destroying Elvis's body. His weight fluctuated wildly. One moment he was slim and athletic. The next he was bloated and overweight. His skin became puffy. His eyes grew distant and unfocused. His voice changed. His performances became erratic and unpredictable. Sometimes he would perform with brilliant energy and passion. Other times he would seem barely conscious, mumbling his lyrics, forgetting his words. Fans began to notice the changes, but they were loyal. They excused his behavior. They told themselves that he was still the king, still the greatest performer who had ever lived. But everyone close to him knew the truth. Elvis was dying slowly, pill by pill, day by day. The irony was that Elvis was incredibly talented, incredibly driven, and incredibly intelligent when he wasn't medicated into oblivion. When he was clean or relatively clean, he was capable of producing great art. He could sing beautifully. He could act. He could perform with genuine passion and connection. But the pharmaceutical mask that he wore became thicker and more impenetrable as the years went by. The real Elvis, the sensitive, intelligent, creative man, was buried beneath layers of pills and pharmaceutical haze. In 1975, Elvis was hospitalized for cardiac arrhythmias. His heart was already showing signs of stress and damage from years of pharmaceutical abuse. But he didn't stop taking the pills. He increased the doses. He added new medications to his regimen. He seemed determined to self-destruct, as if he was in a race with his own mortality. Nobody could stop him. His doctors couldn't stop him. His friends couldn't stop him. His family couldn't stop him. Elvis seemed locked in a battle with demons that only he could see, demons that whispered to him day and night, convincing him that the next pill would make everything better. Lisa Marie watched her father's deterioration with a mixture of fear and resignation. She was a teenager, trying to navigate the normal challenges of adolescence while watching her father slowly destroy himself. She loved him, but she was also angry at him. She was angry that he chose the pills over her. She was angry that he chose isolation over connection. She was angry that he was choosing to leave her again and again, through the haze of his addiction. But she was also heartbroken because she understood on some level that he couldn't help himself, that he was caught in a trap of his own making, unable to escape. By 1977, Elvis was a shadow of his former self. He was only 42 years old, but he looked like a man in his 60s. His body was ravaged by years of pharmaceutical abuse. His health was deteriorating rapidly. His friends and family urged him to get help, to go to a rehabilitation facility to stop taking the pills. But Elvis refused. He seemed resigned to his fate, as if he believed that there was no way out, no escape from the addiction that had consumed his life. On August 16, 1977, Elvis Presley died. He was found on the bathroom floor of Graceland by his fiancée, Ginger Alden. The official cause of death was listed as cardiac arrhythmia. But the truth was far more complex. Elvis died from a combination of his various health problems, all of them exacerbated by years of pharmaceutical abuse. His heart simply gave out. The very organ that had pumped blood to feed his voice, his passion, his incredible talent, finally surrendered. Elvis was 42 years old. The news of Elvis's death sent shockwaves around the world. Fans wept openly in the streets. Radio stations played his music all day long. Newspapers ran special editions dedicated to his life and legacy. He was mourned as one of the greatest performers who had ever lived, a man who had changed American culture forever. But nobody talked about the addiction. Nobody talked about the pills. Nobody wanted to confront the uncomfortable truth that Elvis had been slowly killing himself for years, and that everyone around him, his doctors, his friends, his family, had enabled that process. Lisa Marie was 28 years old when her father died. She attended his funeral, standing at Graceland, surrounded by thousands of mourners, overwhelmed by grief and guilt. Guilt that she hadn't been able to save him. Guilt that she hadn't tried harder to reach him, to connect with him, to pull him away from his addiction. But she was also angry that he had abandoned her, angry that he had chosen the pills over her, angry that he had left her with nothing but memories and unanswered questions. Lisa Marie buried a complicated relationship with her father that day. She buried the little girl who had wanted so desperately to be close to him, and she tried to move on with her life. After Elvis's death, Lisa Marie tried to find some semblance of normalcy. She was wealthy beyond measure. She could buy anything, do anything, go anywhere. But money couldn't fill the void that her father's death had left in her heart. Money couldn't replace the lost time, the missed connections, the conversations they would never have. Lisa Marie began to struggle with her own demons. She turned to relationships, searching for the love and validation that her father had never been able to provide. She married and divorced multiple times. She had various romantic entanglements with famous musicians and actors. She was trying to fill a void that could never be filled, a hole in her heart that had been created the moment her father chose pills over presence. In 1989, Lisa Marie married musician Danny Keough. 2 years later, on February 1, 1992, she gave birth to a son named Benjamin Storm Presley Keough. Ben, as he was known, was Elvis's only grandson. He was born into the same world of wealth and privilege that Lisa Marie had been born into, but he was also born into a legacy of addiction and tragedy. The Presley genes seemed to carry a curse, a predisposition toward substance abuse and self-destruction that skipped no generation. Ben grew up in the shadow of his grandfather's legend. Everyone around him knew who he was, where he came from, what his name meant. They knew that he was the last link in the Presley dynasty, the only remaining male heir to carry the Presley name into the future. But Ben was not Elvis. He didn't have his grandfather's talent, his grandfather's drive, his grandfather's need to be the center of attention. Ben was quieter, more introspective, more vulnerable. He struggled with the weight of his family name. He struggled with the expectations that came with being a Presley. He struggled with the knowledge that addiction ran through his family like a dark river, a river that had claimed his grandfather and threatened to claim him as well. Lisa Marie tried her best to protect Ben from the darker aspects of the family legacy. She loved him fiercely, wanted to shield him from the pain and addiction that had consumed Elvis. But despite her best efforts, the curse of the Presley name was relentless. Ben began to struggle with drugs as a teenager. He got into trouble. He dropped out of school. He seemed to be following the same destructive path that his grandfather had taken. Lisa Marie was devastated. She had tried so hard to break the cycle, to save her son from the fate that seemed to have claimed every Presley. But she was powerless to stop it. In 2014, when Ben was 22 years old, Lisa Marie enrolled him in a rehabilitation facility, hoping that he could get clean and turn his life around. For a while it seemed to work. Ben completed the program. He seemed to be getting better. But addiction is a powerful disease, and it's a disease that often returns with a vengeance when a person stops treatment. Despite Lisa Marie's love and support, despite the best rehabilitation programs and the best medical care that money could buy, Ben could not escape the gravitational pull of addiction. As Lisa Marie matured, she became more introspective about her family's history. She began to understand more deeply the pain that her father had experienced, the pressures that had driven him to pharmaceutical addiction. She began to see the patterns repeating in her own life and in the life of her son. She saw the way that wealth and privilege could actually make addiction worse, because there was no friction, no consequence, no external force to stop a person from their self-destructive behavior. Money meant that you could always get another pill, always find another doctor willing to prescribe, always escape the real world and its harsh realities. Lisa Marie also became aware of the hereditary nature of addiction. She began to study her family's history, to trace the patterns of addiction that seemed to run through the Presley line like a genetic curse. She understood that she might be predisposed to addiction as well. And so, in 2006, Lisa Marie made a public announcement. She had struggled with drug addiction herself. She had become addicted to prescription painkillers, the same type of medication that had destroyed her father's life. She had spent years taking pills, trying to medicate away the pain of her father's death, the pain of her failed relationships, the pain of growing up in the shadow of a legend. But Lisa Marie was different from her father. Unlike Elvis, who had surrounded himself with enablers and doctors willing to prescribe whatever he wanted, Lisa Marie was willing to admit the truth. She was willing to ask for help. She went to rehabilitation. She got clean. She began the long, difficult process of recovery. She spoke publicly about her addiction, trying to raise awareness about the dangers of prescription drug abuse. She became an advocate for addiction recovery, trying to ensure that other people wouldn't have to suffer the way her father had, the way she had. In many ways, Lisa Marie became the adult that her father had never been able to become. She faced her demons. She acknowledged her weaknesses. She sought help. She tried to heal. But healing from addiction is never complete. It's a lifelong process, a constant battle against the urge to escape into substance abuse. Lisa Marie maintained her sobriety, but she lived with the constant knowledge that it could all come crashing down at any moment. She lived with the knowledge that the disease that had killed her father was still inside her, waiting, whispering, trying to convince her that one more pill wouldn't hurt, that she could just use once more and then stop. But she resisted those whispers. She stayed strong. She stayed clean. Throughout the 2000s and 2010s, Lisa Marie became known as a successful businesswoman and philanthropist. She was a board member of the Elvis Presley estate. She was involved in various charitable causes. She had her own music career, releasing several albums and performing as a singer-songwriter. She seemed to have found a sense of purpose and meaning in her life that went beyond the weight of her family name. But she never completely escaped the shadow of her father, and she never completely escaped the knowledge that addiction ran through her family like a dark vein. Ben Presley, Lisa Marie's son, was not as successful in his battle against addiction. By his early 20s, Ben was struggling significantly with substance abuse. In 2017, when Ben was 25 years old, he was arrested for driving under the influence. He was sent back to rehabilitation, but the treatment didn't stick. By 2019, when Ben was 27 years old, his addiction had spiraled completely out of control. He was in and out of rehabilitation facilities. He was arrested multiple times. His family was desperate to help him, but they were powerless to stop him. On July 12, 2020, Ben Presley died. He was only 27 years old. The official cause of death was listed as an intra-abdominal hemorrhage. But the truth was that Ben had died as a direct result of his drug use. His years of substance abuse had damaged his body so severely that a simple internal bleeding could not be stopped. Ben had followed in the footsteps of his grandfather, dying at a relatively young age as a result of damage caused by addiction. The curse of the Presley name had claimed another victim. When Lisa Marie heard the news of her son's death, something inside her broke. She had spent her entire life trying to save her son from the same fate that had claimed her father. She had tried rehabilitation, intervention, tough love, and unconditional support. But none of it had worked. Ben had fallen into the abyss of addiction, and despite her best efforts, she had not been able to pull him out. Lisa Marie fell into a deep depression. She stopped working. She stopped performing. She withdrew from public life. The loss of her son was a wound that would never fully heal. Lisa Marie did eventually emerge from her depression, but she was never quite the same. She became more withdrawn, more reflective. She gave fewer interviews. She seemed to be processing the profound loss of her son, the confirmation of the genetic curse that ran through her family. She became more involved in philanthropy, particularly in causes related to addiction and mental health. She wanted to prevent other families from experiencing the devastation that her family had experienced. She wanted Ben's death to mean something, to serve as a warning to others. But Lisa Marie could not escape the irony that seemed to define the Presley dynasty. Just as her father had been destroyed by the very medications that were supposed to help him, just as her son had been destroyed by the very drugs that he had used to escape his pain, so too was Lisa Marie struggling with her own health issues. She had suffered a cardiac event in 2017 and was taking various medications to manage her health. She had been diagnosed with diabetes, lupus, and other chronic conditions. Her body was paying the price for years of stress, grief, and the psychological toll of living in the shadow of her father's legend and her son's addiction. In November 2023, Lisa Marie suffered a cardiac arrest at her home in Malibu, California. She was rushed to a hospital where doctors were able to revive her, but she remained hospitalized in critical condition. The news of her hospitalization sent shockwaves through the entertainment industry. Fans around the world prayed for her recovery. But on January 12, 2024, Lisa Marie Presley died. She was only 54 years old. The official cause of death was listed as cardiac arrest caused by a change in her body's salt levels brought on by acute gastroenteritis. But the truth was far more complex. Lisa Marie's death seemed to confirm what many people had begun to suspect, that there was something in the Presley family, something that went beyond simple addiction, something that predisposed the Presley family members to early death and health problems. Whether it was the genetic predisposition to addiction, the years of stress and trauma, the environmental factors, or a combination of all these things, the Presley dynasty seemed to carry a curse that no amount of wealth or fame could overcome. 3 generations of Presleys, Elvis, Lisa Marie, and Ben, had all died prematurely. Elvis died at 42 as a result of years of pharmaceutical abuse. Lisa Marie died at 54 as a result of cardiac problems that had been exacerbated by years of stress and grief. Ben died at 27 as a direct result of drug-induced complications. None of them had lived a long and healthy life. None of them had been able to escape the cycle of addiction and tragedy that seemed to define the Presley name. But what connected all 3 deaths? What was the common thread that ran through the Presley family, claiming victim after victim? The answer was complicated and multifaceted, but it all came down to one fundamental truth. The Presleys were all victims of addiction, either to pharmaceuticals or recreational drugs, or the psychological need to escape their reality through substance abuse. And the common cause of their deaths was not a simple one. It was a complex interplay of genetics, environment, trauma, and the human body's desperate attempt to escape from pain and suffering through chemical alteration. Elvis began his pharmaceutical journey in the 1950s, when the dangers of prescription drug abuse were not fully understood. Doctors freely prescribed amphetamines for weight loss and sleeping pills for insomnia. Nobody warned about addiction. Nobody talked about tolerance or dependence. Elvis was given these medications by well-meaning doctors who saw nothing wrong with prescribing them. But over time, Elvis became dependent on these medications. His body developed a tolerance, and he needed more and more pills to achieve the same effect. By the 1970s, Elvis was taking an incredible amount of medication every single day. His body was essentially poisoned by the very medications that were supposed to help him. Lisa Marie watched her father's descent into pharmaceutical addiction and was deeply affected by it. But instead of learning from her father's mistakes, she repeated them. When she was in pain, she took pills. When she was sad, she took pills. When she was anxious, she took pills. She became addicted to prescription painkillers, following almost exactly the same path that her father had taken. It took her many years and significant effort to recognize her addiction and get clean. But even after she had gotten clean, the psychological damage remained. She lived with the fear that she might fall back into addiction at any moment. She lived with the trauma of watching her father kill himself through drug abuse. She lived with the knowledge that the same predisposition to addiction ran through her veins. Ben, Lisa Marie's son, did not have his grandfather's talent or his mother's strength. Ben was a vulnerable, sensitive young man who lacked the psychological resources to handle the pressure and trauma of being a Presley. When he discovered drugs, he used them as an escape from his pain, just like his grandfather had done. But Ben didn't have access to prescription medications in the same way that Elvis had. Instead, he used harder drugs: cocaine, methamphetamine, heroin. These drugs were far more destructive than the pharmaceutical pills that had killed Elvis. They were far more addictive, far more toxic, and far more likely to cause sudden death. Ben's addiction spiraled quickly out of control, and by the time he was 27 years old, his body had been so severely damaged that even a relatively minor medical condition could kill him. The common cause of death for all three Presleys was, in essence, the damage caused by addiction. Whether it was pharmaceutical addiction, recreational drug addiction, or the psychological need to escape through substance abuse, addiction was the killer. Addiction was the disease that ran through the Presley family, that claimed generation after generation, that seemed almost unstoppable despite the best efforts of family members to break the cycle. But there was another factor at play as well, a factor that connected all three deaths on a deeper level. That factor was cardiac disease. Elvis died of cardiac arrhythmias. Lisa Marie died of cardiac arrest. Ben died of intra-abdominal hemorrhage, which was likely caused by his years of drug use damaging his digestive system, but which might not have killed him had his overall health not been so compromised. All three Presleys had cardiac issues, and all three died as a result of those cardiac issues. This raises an interesting question. Was there a genetic predisposition to cardiac disease in the Presley family? Or was the cardiac disease a direct result of years of substance abuse? The answer is probably both. There may be a genetic predisposition to cardiac problems in the Presley family, but that predisposition would have remained dormant if it hadn't been combined with the additional stress and damage caused by years of substance abuse. The damage caused by addiction to the cardiovascular system is well documented. Stimulant drugs like cocaine and methamphetamine are known to cause heart attacks and strokes. Prescription stimulants like amphetamines can also cause cardiac problems with long-term use. Even recreational drugs like heroin can cause cardiac issues through various mechanisms. Years of pharmaceutical abuse, such as what Elvis experienced, can also lead to cardiac problems, particularly if the medications included stimulants or if the medications caused electrolyte imbalances that affected the heart's function. For Lisa Marie, the connection between her stress, grief, and her cardiac problems is perhaps more direct. The loss of her son in 2020 was a traumatic event that caused her immense grief and psychological pain. The human heart is not just a physical organ, it is also affected by our emotional state. Grief, depression, and trauma can all contribute to cardiac problems. Lisa Marie's body was essentially broken by the loss of her son. The cardiac problems that she experienced in 2017 and that ultimately led to her death in 2024 were likely exacerbated by the psychological trauma of losing Ben. So when we talk about the common cause of death for Elvis, Lisa Marie, and Ben Presley, we are talking about a complex interaction of factors. Addiction, genetics, environmental stress, trauma, and the cumulative damage caused by years of pharmaceutical or recreational drug use. We are talking about three people who were all caught in the same trap, three people who all sought escape through chemical alteration, three people who all paid the ultimate price for their attempts to medicate their pain away. Elvis was a man ahead of his time in many ways, but he was also a man trapped in the prison of his own fame. The very thing that made him legendary, his talent, his charisma, his ability to move people emotionally through his music, was also the thing that destroyed him. The fame that came with his talent was so overwhelming, so all-consuming, that he felt forced to self-medicate in order to cope with it. He surrounded himself with people who enabled his addiction because he was too famous, too powerful, too important to say no to. And so he kept taking pills, kept escaping into his pharmaceutical haze, until his heart finally gave out. Lisa Marie grew up watching her father's destruction, which gave her insight and awareness that Elvis never had. She was able to recognize her own addiction and get help. She was able to maintain sobriety for many years. But she could not escape the weight of her family history. She could not escape the knowledge that the same disease that had killed her father was inside her, waiting. And the trauma of losing her son, of watching the cycle of addiction continue into yet another generation, broke something inside her that could not be repaired. Ben was the youngest, the most vulnerable, the least equipped to handle the pressure of his family name and his family history. He did not have his grandfather's talent or his mother's strength. He was caught in the trap of addiction at an even younger age than his grandfather had been. And his addiction was to harder, more destructive drugs. There was no redemption for Ben, no recovery, no escape. He simply burned out, his young body destroyed by years of substance abuse. The tragedy of the Presley family is that it was a tragedy that could have been prevented. If Elvis had been stronger, if he had been willing to resist the temptation to self-medicate, if he had had doctors who were more ethical and less willing to enable his addiction, he might have lived a longer, healthier life. If Lisa Marie had been able to break the cycle of addiction entirely, if she had found healthier ways to cope with her grief and trauma, perhaps she could have protected Ben more effectively. If Ben had grown up in a world that prioritized mental health treatment over substance abuse, if he had had access to better rehabilitation programs, if he had had the psychological resilience to resist addiction, perhaps he would still be alive today. But the Presley family lived in a world where none of these conditions were met. They lived in a world where wealth and fame could purchase pills instead of healing. They lived in a world where addiction was often treated as a moral failing rather than a disease. They lived in a world where the cycle of trauma and addiction was allowed to repeat, generation after generation, without significant intervention or change. And so all three of them died prematurely, all three of them victims of the same fundamental disease: addiction. The story of the Presley dynasty is a story that resonates far beyond the music industry or the world of celebrity. It is a story about addiction, about the vulnerability of the human body and mind to substance abuse, about the way that unresolved trauma can be passed down through families and destroy generation after generation. It is a story that shows us that no amount of wealth or fame or privilege can protect us from the fundamental human vulnerabilities that we all share. Money cannot buy health. Fame cannot buy happiness. Success cannot buy freedom from addiction. The Presley dynasty also raises important questions about the role of medical professionals in enabling addiction. Dr. Nick's willingness to prescribe massive quantities of controlled substances to Elvis was directly responsible for Elvis's addiction and ultimately his death. How many other people have suffered similar fates at the hands of doctors who prioritized profit over patient welfare? How many other families have been destroyed by medical professionals who enabled addiction rather than treating it? The opioid crisis that is ravaging America today is in many ways a continuation of the same problem that destroyed Elvis Presley. The story of the Presley family also raises questions about the nature of fame and its effects on the human psyche. Can someone bear the weight of Elvis-level fame without some form of self-medication? Is it even possible to maintain psychological health while being so intensely focused on by millions of people? Elvis was a prisoner of his own fame, confined to Graceland, unable to go out in public without causing chaos. The only escape he could find was through medication, through altering his consciousness, through creating a pharmaceutical veil between himself and the overwhelming reality of his existence. In a way, Elvis's addiction was a rational response to an irrational situation. But it was still an addiction and it still destroyed him. The Presley dynasty also stands as a testament to the power of family legacy and inherited trauma. Lisa Marie could not escape the knowledge of her father's addiction and his pharmaceutical dependence. That knowledge was embedded in her psyche, shaping her decisions, her relationships, her approach to her own health. She was trying to parent her son Ben while carrying the weight of her father's legacy and the trauma of his death. She was trying to protect him from the same fate while knowing that addiction ran through the family genetics. She was caught between the desire to warn Ben about the dangers of drugs and the desire to protect his innocence. In the end, she could not protect him. The curse of the Presley name claimed him just as it had claimed his grandfather. The most heartbreaking aspect of the Presley dynasty is the recognition that all three of these deaths could have been prevented. Elvis could have gotten clean. He could have gone to a rehabilitation facility. He could have fired Dr. Nick and found ethical medical professionals who would not enable his addiction. Lisa Marie did get clean and she did maintain her sobriety for many years. If she had been able to find Ben better rehabilitation and mental health support, if Ben had been willing to get clean, if the family had been able to break the cycle of addiction, Ben would still be alive today. But none of that happened. Instead, the cycle continued. Instead, the disease of addiction claimed another generation. Instead, the Presley family continued to serve as a warning sign, a reminder of what addiction can do, of how it can destroy families, of how it can kill even the most talented, most privileged, most loved people in our society. Today, the Presley legacy is complicated. Elvis remains one of the greatest musical performers of all time. His music is still listened to and celebrated around the world. His influence on popular culture is immeasurable. But his death, and the circumstances that led to it, serve as a cautionary tale about the dangers of pharmaceutical addiction and self-medication. Lisa Marie has also been memorialized, not just as the daughter of Elvis, but as a woman in her own right. She was a successful businesswoman, a philanthropist, and a singer-songwriter. She was a woman who faced her own addiction, got clean, and tried to use her experience to help others. Her death has renewed conversations about addiction, mental health, and the particular vulnerabilities of people who grow up in the shadow of family trauma. Ben's death has received less public attention, but in many ways, it is the most tragic. He was a young man with his whole life ahead of him, destroyed by the same disease that had destroyed his grandfather. His death represents the failure of the family to break the cycle, the failure of society to adequately address the disease of addiction, the failure of the systems that are supposed to help people get clean and stay clean. The common cause of death for Elvis, Lisa Marie, and Ben Presley was fundamentally addiction. But it was addiction that was enabled by circumstances, by wealth, by lack of accountability, by the failure of medical professionals and family members to intervene effectively. It was addiction that was compounded by trauma, by the weight of family legacy, by the pressure of fame and expectation. It was addiction that expressed itself through the cardiovascular system, through heart disease and cardiac events, through the body's ultimate rebellion against years of chemical abuse and stress. The story of the Presley dynasty reminds us that addiction is a disease that can affect anyone, regardless of their wealth, their fame, their talent, or their privilege. It reminds us that addiction is often rooted in trauma and pain, in the human desire to escape from suffering through chemical alteration. It reminds us that family members often cannot save their loved ones from addiction, no matter how much they love them or how hard they try. And it reminds us that the most effective treatment for addiction is not more medication, not more escape, but connection, support, treatment, and the difficult work of addressing the underlying trauma and pain that often drives addiction in the first place. The three graves of the Presley family, Elvis in Memphis, Lisa Marie also in Memphis, and Ben in Los Angeles, stand as monuments to the destructive power of addiction. They stand as a reminder that the disease does not discriminate, that it affects the rich and the poor, the famous and the unknown, the talented and the ordinary. They stand as a call to action for society to do better in treating addiction, to provide better mental health services, to hold medical professionals accountable for enabling addiction, and to address the underlying trauma and pain that often drive people to substance abuse. The Presley dynasty is a story of 3 lives cut short, 3 generations claimed by the same fundamental disease. It is a story that is both unique and universal, that speaks to the particular vulnerabilities of fame and privilege while also reflecting the broader struggles that millions of people face with addiction every single day. It is a story that deserves to be told, not as a judgment or a condemnation, but as a warning, as a call for compassion, and as a reminder that addiction is a disease that requires treatment, not punishment, support, not shame, and hope, not despair.